Imagine walking into like a high school classroom in Nairobi or maybe a vocational center in Johannesburg. You walk in, you hand 30 teenagers a blank piece of paper, and you basically tell them, hey, there are no stable jobs waiting for you when you graduate.
Right.
The factories aren't hiring. The corporate ladders are just completely broken. So you have to invent your own job out of thin air.
It's a terrifying premise, honestly. I mean, you are essentially demanding that a 16-year-old solve a massive macroeconomic crisis through what, sheer willpower and a hastily drawn business model.
Yeah, exactly. And yet that is the silent subtext of so much of what we call entrepreneurial education today.
Totally.
Because, I mean, we constantly look at these massive disruptive visionaries who have completely altered the way we live, right?
Mm.
And the cultural narrative around them is almost always this mythic thing, like they were just born different.
Foot-lone genius myth.
Right, like they had this rare, unpredictable spark. But now society is looking at that spark and saying, well, we need to mass produce this. We need to bottle that lightning, put it on a curriculum, grade it out of 100, and basically use it to fix our economies.
Which, forces a confrontation with a very fundamental biological and psychological question.
Right.
Are entrepreneurs a distinct personality type? Or are we simply talking about a specific set of learnable behaviors that literally anyone can acquire if you give them the right conditions?
That is exactly the core puzzle we are tearing apart today on this deep dive.
Yeah.
Because if we take a room full of young people and systematically try to teach them how to be risk-taking innovators, what is actually happening inside their brains?
Yeah, what's the actual mechanics of it?
Exactly. So today we are looking at a really fascinating stack of data focused specifically on the impact of entrepreneurial education on youth entrepreneurial intentions. The study is called RYE Minds.
It's incredibly thorough.
It really is. And we are bypassing all that fluffy motivational seminar rhetoric and digging straight into the hard empirical evidence from this source. We want to know if you can actually engineer ambition.
And to do that, we have to look really closely at the psychological machinery of risk-taking. We need to understand how confidence is manufactured.
Manufactured confidence. I love that phrasing.
Thanks, yeah. We have to figure out the difference between a superficial, frankly, completely useless weekend boot camp and a multi-year program that genuinely alters the trajectory of a human life.
Right, because if you are sitting there listening to this, whether you're, I don't know, contemplating a side hustle, or maybe you mentor younger people, or you're just curious about how education shapes our actual economic reality.
Which affects all of us.
Right, exactly. Understanding how to engineer intention is basically a masterclass in human behavior. But before we can analyze whether this type of education actually works, we run into a massive definitional problem right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely.
If you tell me you are funding entrepreneurial education, I have literally no idea what you are actually doing.
Yeah.
Because the spectrum is just incredibly wide.
It is a notoriously vague umbrella term. I mean, you might be referring to a one-day workshop at a secondary school where, a local bakery owner comes in to speak for an hour.
Yeah.
Or you might be talking about a rigorous 4-year university degree. You have after-school clubs, incubator programs, business plan competitions.
And they all get lumped together into the same exact label.
Exactly. But they are operating at entirely different depths of human psychology, and the study breaks this down beautifully.
Let's sort that out, because if we treat it all as one monolithic thing, the data just becomes totally useless. So the research breaks this massive spectrum down into 3 distinct approaches. Let's think of it like trying to teach a young person how to survive in the deep ocean.
Okay, I like this.
The first approach the researchers identify is learning about entrepreneurship. This is your classic, traditional academic model.
Right. And in that setting, the student is observing the phenomenon from a very safe distance. They are sitting at a desk, memorizing the definitions of terms.
Just rote memorization.
Pretty much. They are learning the historical stages of a startup, or maybe analyzing the market conditions that led to a specific corporate success in the 1990s.
So, using that ocean analogy, it's like taking a college course on fluid dynamics to learn how to swim.
Yes, perfect.
You're sitting in this dry lecture hall, you're reading a textbook about water displacement, and you're writing a 5-page essay on the history of the backstroke. You are definitely gaining knowledge.
Sure.
But your hair isn't getting wet. The stakes are absolute zero.
And the problem with the purely theoretical approach, which the data points out, is that passive knowledge does not translate into kinetic action.
Wait, what do you mean by kinetic action in this context?
Well, knowing the historical definition of a value proposition does not inherently create the courage required to go out and test one in a live market. You can know all the terms, but still be terrified to actually talk to a customer.
Right, so knowing how the water moves doesn't stop you from panicking when you get thrown in.
Exactly. So because of that gap, the education system attempts to move to a second tier, which the literature calls learning for entrepreneurship.
Okay, this is where things get a bit more practical, right?
Yeah. The student isn't just learning what a cash flow statement is. They are actually learning how to manage one on a spreadsheet. They are practicing how to structure a pitch deck.
You shift from pure theory to discrete, isolated skills.
Exactly.
So we are out of the lecture hall, and we are like standing on the pool deck. You are lying on a towel, practicing your breathing technique. You are doing the arm motions in the air.
Right.
It feels much more applicable, but let's be honest, you are still on dry land. If you make a mistake, you just erase the whiteboard. There is still no visceral consequence.
Which is why the data increasingly points away from those first two methods if the goal is to actually change human behavior. The research overwhelmingly champions the third category, which is learning through entrepreneurship.
Through entrepreneurship,
Yes. And this one is deeply, uncomfortably experiential.
you are finally thrown into the pool. The water's freezing. You have to remember how to kick. And there's an immediate physical feedback loop if you get it wrong. You literally swallow water.
In an educational context, this means running a simulated business where real money actually changes hands. It means executing a live project where the student has to approach absolute strangers and convince them to buy a physical product.
I have to pause you there, though. Because, I mean, if you throw a 16-year-old into a live market simulation and they fail miserably.
Which they probably will.
Right, because starting a business is incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Doesn't that permanently destroy their confidence? How is swallowing freezing water better than safely reading a book? I would think a humiliating public failure would make them swear off business forever.
That is a highly intuitive concern. It makes total sense. But the psychological data tells a completely different story. It all comes down to how the failure is framed within the environment.
Okay, unpack that framing for me.
Well, when a student reads about a failed business in a textbook, failure remains this abstract, terrifying monster. It's the ultimate bad outcome. But when they experience a micro-failure in a structured experiential program...
Like getting told no by a customer.
Exactly. Say they pitch a product to a stranger on the street and get rejected, they process a vital piece of neurological data in that moment. I survived.
Wow.
The rejection stung, it was awkward, but it didn't destroy them.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's literally like an inoculation. You are giving them a deadened strain of the virus, right?
Yes.
A small, manageable failure, so their immune system learns how to fight it off without going into full panic mode.
You are removing the fear of the game over screen. Think of it like a video game skill tree. Taking a small amount of damage without dying teaches the player the actual limits of the game mechanics.
I love that. You realize, oh, I can take a hit and keep playing.
Exactly. That experiential feedback loop doesn't just teach them a technical skill, it fundamentally rewires their self-perception. They begin to recalibrate what they are capable of surviving.
And that rewiring brings us to the most crucial metric in this entire conversation, I think. Because when we talk about measuring the success of these programs, the researchers aren't tracking 50 teenagers waiting 20 years and then counting how many became CEOs.
Right. That would be completely impossible.
Logistically, it is a nightmare. I mean, over a 20-year gap, 1,000 external variables intervene.
A student might experience a global recession or a family illness, or maybe they get a random inheritance. You can never confidently attribute their eventual business creation back to, a specific high school class they took a decade prior.
The data would be so noisy.
Yeah.
So instead of tracking the eventual action, the researchers in this study track the psychological precursor to that action. They track something called entrepreneurial intention.
Yes.
We are talking about a concrete, measurable psychological state here. It's not just a vague, hey, being my own boss sounds cool. It is a deliberate, formalized plan to take action in the future.
And the underlying premise here is based on a really well-established psychological framework regarding how human beings plan behavior. It's called the theory of planned behavior, originally developed by a guy named Isaac Azen.
Right, Eisen's theory. Let's dig into that.
The core argument is simple, but really profound. Human intention is the absolute strongest predictor of whether someone will actually engage in a specific difficult behavior later on.
Stronger than personality traits.
Much stronger. If you can successfully move the needle on a person's intention, you have drastically increased the statistical probability of them taking action, regardless of all those future variables we just mentioned.
But you can't just inject intention into someone's brain, right? Like you can't just tell a teenager, okay, intend to be an entrepreneur now. It doesn't work like that.
Definitely not.
The research breaks this concept of intention down into 3 psychological hurdles. If a student can clear these 3 hurdles, intention forms naturally as a byproduct. Let's look at the architecture of how this is actually built. The first hurdle is simply desire.
Right. The academic term for this is the internal attitude toward the behavior. The student looks at the concept of entrepreneurship and asks themselves a deeply personal question. Do I actually view this as a good life?
Because if their only exposure to business owners is seeing people who are perpetually stressed, bankrupt, or sacrificing their families for a grind, their attitude is going to be profoundly negative.
Exactly. The intention is dead on arrival.
They just look at it and say, why would I ever want that misery?
So the education program has to actively intervene and reframe that narrative. It has to expose them to the creative freedom, the autonomy, and the problem-solving joy of the path, making it look not just possible, but highly desirable.
Okay, so the student clears hurdle 1. They look at the lifestyle and they say, yeah, I want this. But hurdle 2 is where things get really messy because it involves everyone else in their life.
This is the tricky one.
The second hurdle is social permission. The researchers call it subjective norms. This is the invisible gravitational pull of their family and their community.
And this is notoriously the hardest element for any classroom to alter. I mean, think about it. You can have a phenomenal teacher who spends 6 months convincing a student that starting a logistics company is a brilliant, viable career path.
The kid is totally fired up.
Totally fired up. But the moment that student sits down at the dinner table and announces their plan, if their parents immediately panic and say, absolutely not, we did not sacrifice everything so you could gamble your future. You need to get a stable job at a bank, keep your head down, and get a pension.
Oh, man. The friction is immense. The classroom education is suddenly at war with decades of entrenched cultural and familial survival instincts.
Because the parents aren't being malicious. They are terrified.
Right. They want their kid to be safe. But the social norm acts as a massive deterrent. The student has to expend an enormous amount of psychological energy just to maintain their intention in the face of familial disappointment.
It's exhausting for them.
Which makes the third hurdle even more critical. Because if you are going to fight your own family's expectations, you better have an ironclad belief in yourself.
You really do.
The third hurdle is belief in ability. The technical term in the data is perceived behavioral control, or basically self-efficacy.
And this is perhaps the most liberating concept in the entire field of study, in my opinion.
How so?
Well, confidence is so often culturally framed as a genetic lottery. We talk about people being naturally confident or born leaders, but the data completely dismantles that myth. Entrepreneurial self-efficacy is a measurable, highly malleable metric. It can be engineered.
Oh, this goes back to the inoculation concept we talked about with experiential learning.
It connects directly to it. When a student is forced to navigate a chaotic team conflict, when they have to manage a tiny real-world budget, or when they endure the sting of a rejected pitch, they are collecting empirical data about their own resilience.
They are proving to themselves that they won't break.
Yes, they're proving they can execute complex, ambiguous tasks. And that engineered self-efficacy is the absolute rocket fuel for intention.
But let me push back on this whole premise for a second. We now know how to hack a teenager's brain. We can put them in an experiential simulation. We can build their self-efficacy through micro-failures. We can shift their attitude, and boom, we have manufactured an entrepreneur.
Okay.
But we need to ask a really uncomfortable question. Why are we doing this?
You mean the motive behind the curriculum itself?
Are we doing this because we genuinely want to unleash a generation of brilliant, self-actualized innovators? Or is there a more cynical top-down motive at play? Because when you look at where a lot of this education is heavily pushed, the data specifically highlights regions like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa.
High unemployment contexts.
Yeah, exactly. You are looking at contexts where youth unemployment isn't just a statistic, it is a generational crisis.
And the macroeconomic reality radically alters the meaning of the education. When massive educational institutions or state governments heavily mandate entrepreneurship training in high unemployment environments, the danger is that it becomes a policy band-aid.
a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It feels like a massive abdication of responsibility. The state has failed to create a functioning economy with enough stable, dignified jobs. So the proposed solution is to turn to a classroom of 16-year-olds and say, well, the burden is now entirely on you. Good luck. Go invent a job.
The literature makes a stark distinction here that perfectly captures your concern. It's the difference between opportunity-driven entrepreneurship and necessity-driven entrepreneurship.
Break that down because I imagine the daily reality of those two paths looks wildly different.
Fundamentally different. An opportunity-driven entrepreneur is someone who is pulled into the market by the promise of innovation. They were walking down the street, they see a genuine gap in the market, say a massive inefficiency in how local farmers transport crops, and they create a venture to solve it.
Right? They're motivated by growth, creativity, scaling a solution. That is the Silicon Valley archetype we all like to romanticize.
Exactly. But a necessity-driven entrepreneur, conversely, is pushed into the market by absolute economic desperation. They start a business because formal employment is completely unavailable and they have to feed themselves today.
So what does that business actually look like?
This usually takes the form of an informal, low-margin, highly replicable business. Think of someone selling identical phone cases on a street corner where 10 other people are selling the exact same phone cases.
There's no innovation there. There's no growth strategy. It is pure, brutal survival. But how does that reality seep into the classroom? Like if a teacher is just delivering a standardized curriculum, does the student really know the difference?
Teenagers possess an incredibly fine-tuned radar for hypocrisy and panic.
Oh, that's so true.
If an educational program secretly carries the subtext of, hey, we are teaching you these survival skills because there is no safety net waiting for you, the students absorb that underlying anxiety. It fundamentally warps the mindset being developed.
Instead of an expansive mindset, it creates a contracted defensive mindset.
Exactly. Instead of a curriculum that opens their minds to spotting unique opportunities and taking calculated long-term risks, it becomes a curriculum of desperate self-reliance. And the data shows that this tends to produce survival-based businesses that rarely scale.
And I imagine they rarely create secondary jobs for the community, right?
Right, and they have brutally low long-term survival rates. The intention might technically be high on paper, but it is the intention to merely survive, not to truly build.
Okay, so how do we fix the curriculum? Let's play a game. Let's say we have unlimited resources and we want to design the ultimate flawless program based on this study. We want to avoid the necessity trap entirely. We want to genuinely empower students to chase opportunities regardless of how bleak the surrounding economy might be. What are the actual pillars of that perfect program?
Okay, the research isolates 4 distinct pillars of high-quality intervention. We have already spent a lot of time on the first one, which is experiential learning. Getting them in the pool, letting them feel the cold water, and letting them survive the micro-failures.
Right. The inoculation. Got it. So what is the second pillar?
The second pillar is mentorship and role modeling, and we have to get highly specific about what kind of role model actually works, because getting this wrong is honestly worse than doing nothing at all.
Wait, how can a role model be worse than nothing? Isn't showing a student a billionaire just inherently inspiring?
Actually, no. If you are a young person sitting in a classroom in a marginalized neighborhood, and the only examples of successful entrepreneurs you ever see are tech billionaires who grew up in entirely different socioeconomic realities.
Right, guys with massive safety nets and Ivy League connections.
Exactly. Your brain processes that information very logically. It concludes, okay, entrepreneurship is a real thing, but it is a thing that happens to an entirely different species of human. It does not apply to me.
The cognitive distance is just too far. Just reinforces their own perceived limitations.
The psychological concept here is vicarious experience as a generator of self-efficacy. This was theorized by Albert Bandura. For vicarious experience to actually work, the student must see themselves in the model.
So the mirror has to reflect them.
Exactly. When a program brings in a mentor who grew up on the exact same street, who faced the exact same systemic biases, who speaks the same local dialect, and that person has built a thriving business.
It shatters the abstraction.
Completely shatters it.
It provides an undeniable psychological proof of concept. The student's brain is forced to recalibrate. They think, well, if their starting line was exactly the same as mine and they made it, then the defect isn't in me. I actually have the capacity to do this.
The relatable mentor is perhaps the most powerful tool for dismantling those negative subjective norms we discussed earlier. It offers an alternative social reality.
All right, so we have hands-on experience and we have hyper-relatable mentors. The third pillar of our perfect program is integration with real market context, which sounds like a fancy way of saying stop using terrible textbooks.
Essentially, yes. It means the curriculum must match the reality outside the window. A disastrous program will hand a student in Nairobi a generic business plan template based on the regulatory environment of, like, a mid-sized tech company in Ohio.
That's absurd. It is profoundly disconnected from their daily reality.
Totally.
I can imagine how jarring that would be.
Mm.
You are sitting in class reading about SEC filings and venture capital term sheets, but you walk outside and the entire local economy runs on cash, informal credit, and WhatsApp groups.
Right. A high-quality program forces the student to look at their actual immediate surroundings. It requires them to identify hyperlocal problems and devise local solutions. Furthermore, the curriculum absolutely must incorporate the actual mechanics of the local economy.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, in many of the emerging markets highlighted in the data, this means teaching the dynamics of the informal sector. It means understanding how mobile money networks operate in real time. It means discussing how to build and leverage community trust networks.
Because a community trust network is probably far more critical than a formal legal contract when the court system is totally inaccessible or too expensive.
Exactly. If you don't teach them that, you're setting them up to fail.
So you aren't teaching them how to be an entrepreneur in theory. You are teaching them how to be an entrepreneur in their specific zip code.
Yes. If the education ignores the local ecosystem, it is worse than useless. It is actively disorienting.
Which brings us to the fourth and final pillar of the perfect program, sustained duration. And this is where I see so many well-meaning organizations fail.
All the time.
They love the optics of a startup weekend or a one-day innovation boot camp. They rent out a nice hall, they bring in dynamic speakers, they blast upbeat music, and they get 100 teenagers hyped up on whiteboards and sticky notes.
It is the educational equivalent of a massive energy drink.
Exactly. By Saturday afternoon, everyone is buzzing, their self-efficacy is peaking, their intentions are sky high, they are ready to conquer the global market. But what actually happened?
What happens is the inevitable brutal crash. By Tuesday morning, the energy drink has completely worn off. The student is back in their normal routine.
Back to reality.
And the structural barriers of their daily life, the lack of money, the skeptical parents, the broken transport system, they all reassert themselves with full force. The spike in enthusiasm just dissipates into thin air.
So what does the data say about these short programs?
The empirical data is ruthless on this point. Short, one-off interventions have almost zero durable impact on long-term entrepreneurial intention.
It's literally a sugar rush.
Yeah.
A genuine high-quality program acts like slow-release nutrition. It is integrated over a semester or a year or multiple years. It permanently alters the student's baseline capabilities through continuous, repeated exposure, iterative failure, and sustained support.
You are building a permanent psychological foundation, not just inducing a temporary state of manic excitement.
Okay, but let's play this out to its logical conclusion. Let's imagine we actually do it. We build this utopian program, we fund it perfectly, it is deeply experiential, it features phenomenal local mentors, it is hyper-focused on the real market context, and it is a sustained multi-year effort.
Sounds great.
A student goes through this program and graduates. They have unshakable self-efficacy. They have a brilliant, opportunity-driven idea that solves a real local problem. Their intention is fully locked in.
They are the ideal output of the educational system.
So why aren't they building the next massive company the very next day? What is the invisible wall they are hitting? Because the data shows that even with perfect intention, the action doesn't always follow.
And this is where we have to zoom out from the psychology of the individual and look at the brutal reality of the macroeconomic ecosystem. The data is explicit on this. Entrepreneurial education is a necessary catalyst, but it is entirely insufficient on its own.
Insufficient because of what awaits them.
Right, because when that perfectly educated, highly motivated teenager walks out of the classroom, they're stepping into an economic architecture that is often fundamentally designed to lock them out.
Explain that architecture. What does that invisible wall actually look like when they try to push through it? Walk me through a day in their life post-graduation.
Okay, it manifests as a series of systemic, interlocking brick walls. The most immediate and fatal barrier is the lack of access to finance. This young graduate, despite their brilliant pitch deck and high self-efficacy, has zero formal credit history. They do not own property to offer as collateral.
And traditional banking institutions are essentially just risk-averse algorithms. I imagine a 19-year-old walking into a bank in Johannesburg pitching a tech platform. The loan officer looks at an unproven kid with no assets and a new idea, and the computer simply says no.
The risk appetite for youth ventures within traditional finance is effectively zero. So the brilliant, opportunity-driven idea simply starves to death on the vine because it cannot be capitalized.
That's heartbreaking.
But let's say by an absolute miracle, they scrape together a tiny bit of seed money from their community. They immediately hit the next wall. Massive infrastructural deficits.
Right. Depending on the region, we are talking about unreliable power grids that fry equipment, expensive or spotty internet access that severs communication with clients, or broken logistics networks that make delivering a physical product impossibly expensive.
Add to that a regulatory environment that is often wildly complex, bureaucratic, and outright hostile.
Hostile how?
Well, the process of legally registering a small business, paying taxes, or obtaining licenses can require navigating a labyrinth of red tape. The system often assumes the business has a full-time legal department.
It is incredibly frustrating even just to talk about. We are pouring all these philanthropic and state resources into engineering this perfect, resilient mindset inside a classroom, and then we're tossing that student out into a harsh, unforgiving environment that immediately suffocates them.
The implication for policymakers here is very clear. You cannot look at education in a vacuum. If a government or an NGO is going to promote entrepreneurial education, it is a moral imperative that they pair it with sweeping structural changes.
Like what?
We are talking about designing alternative credit models specifically for youth, mandating financial inclusion policies, aggressively streamlining regulatory reform for micro-enterprises.
If you don't build the on-ramp, there is literally no point in teaching them how to drive. You are just building up immense hope, only to have it crushed by a reality they cannot control.
It is a profound systemic failure. Education is only one node in a much larger network. If the financial and regulatory nodes are broken, the entire system collapses, no matter how good the teacher is.
And the data reveals something even more troubling about this hostile ecosystem outside the classroom. The playing field is not just broken, it is aggressively tilted. That hostile environment isn't equally hostile to everyone. Who is facing the steepest, most punishing climb when they try to turn their intention into action?
The research highlights profound demographic disparities, focusing primarily on two massive structural divides: the gender gap and the socioeconomic bind.
Let's tackle gender first.
Okay. If we look at gender, the data is stark, consistent, and global. Across the board, young women report significantly lower entrepreneurial intentions and significantly lower entrepreneurial self-efficacy than young men.
Now, let's stop right there and be incredibly precise about what the data is not saying. This is absolutely not a capability issue. There is zero evidence suggesting young women are less capable of running businesses, managing risk, or innovating.
None whatsoever. The disparity in intention is entirely a byproduct of structural messaging. It ties directly back to our discussion on subjective norms and the social friction required to form an intention.
Right, the dinner table conversation.
Exactly. The pervasive global image of the entrepreneur is still aggressively, implicitly coded as male.
Think about the archetype, the lone wolf, the aggressive disruptor, the rule breaker. All traits that society praises in young men and actively polices in young women.
That's exactly it. When a young man stands up at the dinner table and announces, "I'm going to skip university, take out a massive loan, and start a tech company," the cultural narrative immediately validates him. He is viewed as a maverick, he is a risk taker, he is ambitious.
He gets a pat on the back. But when a young woman stands up and proposes the exact same plan, the social feedback loop changes instantly. The friction is palpable.
She is frequently met with deep skepticism or outright pushback. The family might express concern about the appropriateness of the path. They worry about the instability. They question how this chaotic lifestyle will fit with traditional gender roles, future family responsibilities, or societal expectations of security.
The psychological tax is just enormous. Before she even attempts to write a business plan, she has to expend massive amounts of emotional energy just pushing through the social friction to form the intention itself.
Right.
A young man is handed the intention on a silver platter.
Sure.
A young woman has to fight her community just to hold on to it.
Which underscores why the educational interventions we discussed earlier, specifically the use of highly relatable female role models, are not just a nice bonus for a program. They are a structural necessity to actively dismantle and counteract the societal bias being poured into these students every day.
And then we look at the second major disparity, the socioeconomic bind. This is a heartbreaking paradox in the data.
It truly is. The research points out that young people from lower income backgrounds often possess incredibly high baseline motivation. For them, entrepreneurship isn't a fun extracurricular project or a way to optimize their resume.
It's not a hobby.
No. It is viewed as a vital, urgent escape route from systemic economic insecurity. Their attitude toward the behavior is highly positive.
The desire is off the charts. They want to work.
But they face the highest, most impenetrable barriers when it comes to the resources required to actually act on that motivation. They lack the foundational startup capital. They lack the influential generational networks that can casually introduce a young founder to an angel investor or a key client.
And crucially, fundamentally, they lack a safety net.
Yes.
The absence of a safety net changes the entire neurobiology of risk. If a wealthy, connected student starts a company and it goes bankrupt, it is, what, a valuable learning experience.
Right, a resume builder.
They move back into their parents' comfortable home, they tap their network, and they get a job at a consultancy firm. The risk is an illusion.
The consequences are entirely cushioned. But if a low-income student takes a risk on a startup and it fails, the consequences are existential. It can mean absolute financial ruin. It can mean eviction. It can mean pulling resources away from dependents who rely on them. The stakes are wildly asymmetrical.
Which brings us to a concept that I think is the most powerful underlying revelation of this entire analysis. When we talk about these marginalized groups, whether it's young women fighting centuries of structural gender norms or lower-income youth navigating a system designed to keep them poor, we spend so much time debating the mechanics of the curriculum.
Too much time.
We argue about whether they should learn lean canvases or cash flow statements or pitch decks. But for a student who has been implicitly told by society their entire life that they do not belong in the halls of power, that they are not meant to build wealth, that they are destined to be a compliant employee and nothing else.
Education isn't just about learning a technical skill.
Exactly. It goes much deeper than skill acquisition.
What is it about them?
It is about permission.
Wow, yeah.
The psychological weight of those subjective norms is crushing, and lifting it requires an external force. Sometimes the most radical, transformative thing an entrepreneurial education program can do has absolutely nothing to do with teaching a business model.
It's the human element.
Yes. It is simply creating an environment where a recognized authority figure, a teacher, a local mentor, an institution, looks that marginalized young person directly in the eye and says, "This path is open to you. You are allowed to take up space in the global economy. You have the raw capacity to create, and you are officially granted permission to build."
For a human being who has never been given that permission, it is a life-altering intervention. It shifts their entire paradigm of what is possible.
When we pull all of this together, the narrative the data tells us is complex but incredibly clear. We know from the RYE Minds study that entrepreneurial intention is not some mystical, innate genetic trait. It is a highly malleable psychological state. We can engineer the attitude, the social resistance, and the self-efficacy required to take massive risks.
However, we also know the limits of that engineering. Cheap, short-term, generic programs are worse than ineffective. They are a waste of crucial resources. To create true, durable change, society must invest in programs that are deeply experiential, highly localized to the reality of the market, and sustained over long periods of time with relatable mentorship.
And the final, harshest lesson. Even the most brilliantly designed education is utterly futile if it is not paired hand in hand with sweeping macroeconomic reform. We cannot ask teenagers to out-innovate broken banking systems and hostile regulatory environments. The structural barriers must be torn down alongside the psychological ones.
Completely agree.
As we wrap up this analysis, I want to bring this massive systemic conversation right back down to your daily life. Because while we have been talking about high school students in global economies, the underlying psychology of intention applies directly to how you navigate your own ambition.
It scales to the individual level.
Totally. Think about the content you consume, the advice you take, and the ways you try to advance your own career or side hustle. I urge you to be a highly critical, demanding consumer of your own education. Ask yourself, are you just sitting in a dry lecture hall reading a textbook about fluid dynamics?
Are you staying on dry land?
Right. Are you engaging in comfortable passive learning that makes you feel productive but risks nothing? Or are you actively seeking out the hard, uncomfortable, visceral feedback that actually builds your self-efficacy? Are you forcing yourself to get in the freezing water?
It is the only reliable mechanism for expanding your capacity to survive failure.
And finally, I want to leave you with a lingering thought to carry with you today. We started this whole discussion by questioning whether you can institutionalize a spark, whether you can mass-produce that mythic lightning in a bottle. And we discovered that the ultimate, often hidden value of these programs isn't teaching accounting. It is simply granting a human being the psychological permission to see themselves as a creator.
The permission to build.
So look around your own immediate ecosystem. Look at your workplace, your neighborhood, your own family. Who is standing in the wings right now? Who is full of unexpressed potential, but is quietly being held back by the crushing weight of societal expectations or a lack of a safety net? Consider the possibility that the only thing standing between them and their first massive leap of faith is someone finally giving them permission. And ask yourself, who in your life is waiting for that exact permission from you right now?